October 19th, 2024. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington state, approximately 40 miles northeast of Portland, Oregon. Three hikers were making their way through dense forest on an unmarked trail, enjoying the fall colors and the solitude that came from being miles from the nearest maintained path. Robert Chen, 32 years old and an experienced outdoorsman, was leading the small group. With him were his friends Angela Martinez and David Kim. Both, in their early 30s, all of them part of a hiking club that regularly explored the more remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. They'd been hiking for about 3 hours when Robert noticed something that didn't belong. Through the thick undergrowth of ferns, moss, and decades of accumulated forest debris, he could see lines that were too straight, angles that were too precise to be natural. "Hold up," Robert said, stopping and pulling out his phone to check their GPS coordinates. They were about 4 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, in an area that saw very few visitors. "There's something over there." The three of them pushed through the vegetation, and as they got closer, the structure became clearer. It was made of concrete, partially buried in the hillside, almost completely covered by vegetation that had grown over and around it for what must have been decades. Moss covered every exposed surface. Small trees and bushes grew from the earth piled on top of it. If Robert hadn't happened to notice those unnatural angles, they could have walked within 20 feet of it and never known it was there. The structure was a bunker, approximately 20 feet wide by 30 feet long, built with concrete walls that appeared to be at least a foot thick. The roof was also concrete, covered with several feet of earth that had accumulated over the years, making the structure nearly invisible from above. What made Robert's heart beat a little faster was the entrance. A heavy metal door, badly rusted but still on its hinges, stood partially open. Someone had spray-painted graffiti in red on the concrete wall beside the door. It looked like it had been there for years, but not decades, a reminder that even remote places sometimes attracted the occasional explorer or vandal. Robert approached the entrance carefully and shined his flashlight inside. The smell that wafted out was musty, damp, the smell of enclosed spaces that hadn't been properly ventilated in a very long time. But the beam of his flashlight revealed something that made him pause. This wasn't just an abandoned military structure from World War II or the Cold War era. The Pacific Northwest had a number of those, forgotten bunkers and observation posts built during times when the West Coast had felt potentially vulnerable to attack. This bunker had been occupied, recently in historical terms. Inside, Robert could see furniture, a metal bed frame, the mattress long since rotted away to almost nothing, a wooden table, badly damaged by water and time, metal chairs, rusted but still standing, shelves along the walls, some of them collapsed, others still intact, and what looked like boxes, containers, items that suggested someone had lived here. "Is it safe?" Angela asked, hanging back from the entrance. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "We shouldn't go in. Old concrete can be unstable, and who knows what's in there? Animals, bad air, structural problems. But we need to report this." He took several photographs of the exterior and the view from the entrance, then marked the location carefully on his GPS. When they returned to cell service hours later, Robert contacted the U.S. Forest Service to report the discovery. 3 days later, a Forest Service investigation team arrived at the coordinates Robert had provided, accompanied by a structural engineer to assess whether the bunker was safe to enter. What they found inside would transform a curious historical artifact into a mystery that reached back 57 years, to the Cold War, to NATO military cooperation, and to the disappearance of a German colonel who'd vanished without explanation in 1967. The structural engineer determined that while the bunker showed significant deterioration, it was still relatively stable. The concrete construction had been solid, and while water infiltration over the decades had caused damage, the structure wasn't in danger of immediate collapse. With proper safety measures in place, investigators entered the bunker with high-powered portable lights and began documenting what they found. The interior had been divided into sections, creating distinct living spaces in what had originally been a single large room. There was a sleeping area with the metal bed frame Robert had seen from the entrance. The remains of a mattress were barely recognizable, having decayed over decades of moisture and time. Blankets had rotted to fragments. A pillow was just a shapeless mass of deteriorated fabric. A kitchen area contained a portable propane stove, its tanks long since empty. Shelves held cans of food, most of them rusted through, their contents having long ago exploded or liquefied as the cans deteriorated. There were a few pots and pans, utensils, all heavily rusted but still recognizable. But it was in what appeared to have been a work or office area that investigators found something that would change everything. A wooden table, badly, water-damaged and covered in mold. A metal chair that had rusted but remained intact. And on metal shelves along one wall, partially protected in plastic containers that had kept some of the moisture at bay, were documents, papers, photographs, books, and most significantly, identification and personal records, all in German. The identification was from the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of West Germany. It belonged to Oberst Klaus Werner Bergmann. Oberst was the German rank equivalent to colonel. The ID showed he'd been born on March 4th, 1923, in Munich. The photograph on the military ID showed a man in his 40s, with dark hair beginning to show gray at the temples, light-colored eyes, and a serious, almost stern expression. But there were other photographs in the bunker, stored in a box that had protected them reasonably well. Some showed the same man in what appeared to be Germany, clearly taken years earlier. Others showed him in various military uniforms, both German and American, at what appeared to be different military bases. And remarkably, some photographs showed him in this very bunker. Self-portraits taken with a camera on a tripod, documenting his life in this hidden refuge. Most significantly, there were diaries. Multiple notebooks filled with careful, methodical handwriting in German. The dates on the covers and in the entries ran from September 1967 through February 1976. Nearly 9 years of entries, documenting the life of a man living alone in a hidden bunker in the forest. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What investigators discovered in that bunker would reveal the story of a German military officer who disappeared during the Cold War, lived in isolation for nearly a decade, and then vanished again, leaving behind only his possessions and his writings to explain why he'd fled from everything he'd known. The Forest Service investigation team immediately recognized that they'd discovered something that went beyond simple local historical interest. A West German military officer's identification and personal belongings in an abandoned bunker in Washington state raised questions that needed answers. The team contacted the FBI, which still maintained jurisdiction over cases involving foreign military personnel in the United States, and also reached out to the German government through diplomatic channels. Within a week, the story began to come together. Oberst Klaus Werner Bergmann had indeed been in the United States in 1967. Records from that era, some declassified and some still maintained by both U.S. and German military archives, confirmed that Klaus had been part of a NATO officer exchange program. During the Cold War, NATO member nations regularly sent military officers to train with Allied forces. The purpose was to improve coordination, share tactical knowledge, and build relationships that would be crucial if NATO forces ever had to operate together in combat. It was part of the larger strategy of presenting a unified front against the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact nations. Klaus Werner Bergmann had arrived in the United States in June 1967, assigned to Fort Lewis in Washington state. Now known as Joint Base Lewis-McChord, Fort Lewis in 1967 had been a major U.S. Army installation with significant training facilities. Klaus was scheduled to spend 6 months there, participating in training exercises and observing American military operations and procedures. He was expected to return to West Germany in December 1967. But on September 23, 1967, Klaus had failed to appear for a scheduled briefing at Fort Lewis. When officers went to check his quarters, they'd found that while most of his belongings remained, including his uniform and official documents, some personal items were missing. Most significantly, the car he'd been using was gone. The car was found 3 days later in a parking lot in Portland, Oregon, about 100 miles south of Fort Lewis. It was unlocked, with the keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of struggle or violence. The car had simply been abandoned. The disappearance of a foreign military officer on U.S. soil during the height of the Cold War had been taken very seriously. The FBI had been brought in immediately. There were concerns about potential defection to the Soviet bloc. Could Klaus have been a double agent? Could he have fled to East Germany or the Soviet Union? Extensive investigation had been conducted. Immigration and customs records had been checked for any indication that Klaus had left the United States. The Canadian and Mexican borders had been alerted. Airlines had been contacted. But there was no evidence that Klaus Werner Bergmann had left the country. The West German government had cooperated fully with the investigation. Klaus had been a respected officer with no history of disciplinary problems or security concerns. His service record was exemplary. He joined the Bundeswehr when it was established in 1955, had risen through the ranks steadily, and had been considered a reliable, competent officer. Klaus's family in West Germany, a wife and 2 teenage children, had been interviewed. They'd been devastated by his disappearance and had no explanation for it. Klaus had written to them regularly during his time in the United States, and his letters had given no indication of problems or concerns. The last letter his wife had received had been dated September 15th, just 8 days before his disappearance. As weeks became months with no trace of Klaus, the prevailing theory had become that he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown, had fled, and had either died somewhere in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest or had committed suicide. The case had eventually gone cold, remaining officially unsolved. Now, 57 years later, the discovery of the bunker provided answers to some questions while raising entirely new ones. Klaus Werner Bergmann hadn't died in September 1967. He'd fled deliberately, had found this abandoned bunker, and had lived in it in complete isolation for nearly 9 years. But why? And what had happened to him after the last diary entry in February 1976, when he would have been 53 years old? Klaus Werner Bergmann had been born in Munich on March 4, 1923, into a middle-class German family. His father had been a school teacher, his mother a homemaker. Klaus had grown up during the tumultuous years of the Weimar Republic and had been a teenager when World War II began. The details of Klaus's experiences during the war years were vague in the documents found in the bunker, but it was clear that he'd witnessed the destruction of Germany, the Allied bombing, campaigns, and the eventual occupation and division of his country. He'd been too young to serve in the Wehrmacht during most of the war, but he'd been old enough to see the consequences of Nazi Germany's actions and the horrific price the German people had paid for following Hitler. After the war, Klaus had lived through the Allied occupation, the division of Germany into East and West, and the beginning of the Cold War. Like many young German men of his generation, he'd had to navigate a complicated world where Germany was no longer a unified nation and where the recent past hung over everything like a shadow. In 1955, when West Germany was allowed to rearm and establish the Bundeswehr as part of NATO's defense against the Soviet Union, Klaus had been among the first to join. He'd been 32 years old enough to have the maturity and judgment that the new German military wanted in its officers, but young enough that his own involvement in the Nazi era had been minimal. He'd been a teenager during the war, not an adult with decision-making power. Klaus had built a solid career in the Bundeswehr. He'd been disciplined, professional, and had risen steadily through the ranks. By the mid-1960s, he'd achieved the rank of Oberst, Colonel, and had been considered a reliable officer who represented the new, democratic Germany that West German leaders wanted to project to the world. In 1967, at age 44, Klaus had been selected for the NATO Officer Exchange Program. It was considered an honor, a sign that he was trusted and valued. He'd been married for over 15 years to his wife Helga, and they had 2 children, a son who was 17 and a daughter who was 15. Klaus's selection for the exchange program meant 6 months away from his family, but it was an opportunity that could advance his career and strengthen the ties between the Bundeswehr and the U.S. military. Klaus had arrived at Fort Lewis in Tulvidinai, June 1967. His assignment was to observe and participate in training exercises, to learn American military procedures and tactics, and to serve as a liaison who could help improve coordination between German and American forces. The Cold War in 1967 was at a tense point. The Vietnam War was escalating. The arms race between NATO and the Warsaw Pact continued. Berlin remained divided, a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain that split Europe. Military cooperation among NATO allies was considered crucial to deterring Soviet aggression. For Klaus, the opportunity to work with American forces should have been straightforward, a professional experience that would benefit both his career and the alliance between West Germany and the United States. But something had gone wrong. Something that Klaus discovered or realized during those 3 months at Fort Lewis had been so disturbing to him that he'd made the desperate decision to disappear, completely. What that something was would only become clear when investigators, in 2024, translated and analyzed the diaries Klaus had left behind in the bunker. Saturday, September 23, 1967. Klaus Werner Bergmann was scheduled to attend a briefing at Fort Lewis at 0900 hours. It was a routine meeting, nothing unusual. When Klaus didn't appear, his absence was noted, but not immediately alarming. Perhaps he'd misunderstood the schedule, or there'd been some miscommunication. But when officers went to Klaus's quarters to check on him around 10 a.m., they'd found the room partly empty. Klaus's U.S. Army-issued uniforms were still there, hanging in the closet. His Bundeswehr uniforms were there. His official papers and identification were there. But his civilian clothes were gone. A suitcase was missing. And most telling, personal items, photographs of his family, some books, his personal toiletries, had been taken. The car Klaus had been using, a sedan provided by the motor pool for the use of visiting officers, was not in its assigned parking spot. By late afternoon, when Klaus still hadn't appeared and hadn't contacted anyone, The situation had escalated to a formal report of a missing officer. The military police had been notified. A search of the base and the immediate surrounding area had been conducted. Klaus's car had been reported to local law enforcement. On Tuesday, September 26th, 3-day disappearance, Portland police had called Fort Lewis. Klaus's car had been found in a public parking lot near the Willamette River in downtown Portland. The keys were in the ignition. The car was unlocked. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. What there was, sitting on the passenger seat, was a map of Washington and Oregon with several areas circled in pencil, all of them in remote forest regions east of Portland and north into Washington state. The FBI's involvement had been immediate. A foreign military officer disappearing during the Cold War was a serious security concern. Special Agent Thomas Crawford, who specialized in counterintelligence, had taken charge of the investigation. The first assumption had been defection. Could Klaus have been a Soviet agent who'd been in the United States not to train with American forces, but to gather intelligence? Could he have used the exchange program as cover? The abandoned car could have been staged, and Klaus could have been spirited away to the Soviet Union or East Germany. But investigation had revealed no evidence supporting that theory. Klaus's background had been thoroughly vetted before he'd been accepted into the exchange program. His service record in the Bundeswehr had been exemplary. There were no red flags, no suspicious contacts, no indication that he'd ever had sympathies toward the East or communism. Moreover, surveillance of known Soviet intelligence operatives in the United States had revealed no unusual activity around the time of Klaus's disappearance. If the Soviets had extracted Klaus, they'd done it without any of the normal indicators that American counterintelligence watched for. Interviews with Klaus's colleagues at Fort Lewis had revealed nothing unusual. Klaus had been professional, friendly, but not overly social, dedicated to his work. He'd participated in all his assigned duties. He'd had no known conflicts with anyone. Several American officers had described him as serious and thoughtful, someone who took his responsibilities seriously. The German government had been kept fully informed. Through diplomatic channels, investigators had learned that Klaus had no history of mental illness, no financial problems, no personal issues that might explain a sudden disappearance. His family in Germany had been interviewed by German intelligence services, and they'd been genuinely bewildered and grief-stricken. Helga Bergmann, Klaus's wife, had told German investigators that Klaus's letters from America had been normal, describing his work, asking about the children, expressing how much he missed home. The last letter, dated September 15th, had given no hint of distress. Klaus had written that he was looking forward to coming home in December, and that he had much to tell her about his experiences in America. As the investigation had continued through October and November of 1967 with no new leads, the theory that gained the most traction was psychological breakdown. Perhaps Klaus had experienced some kind of crisis, homesickness, depression, anxiety, that had overwhelmed him. Perhaps he'd felt unable to continue with his duties, but had been too ashamed to admit weakness. Perhaps he'd fled into the wilderness in a state of mental confusion and had perished there, his body simply never found. The vast forests of the Pacific Northwest could hide many secrets. If Klaus had walked into the woods and collapsed from exposure, or had fallen into a ravine, or had been attacked by an animal, his remains might never be discovered. The case had remained officially open, but had gradually been downgraded from active investigation to cold case status. Klaus Werner Bergmann was listed as missing, his fate unknown. But now, 57 years later, the bunker told a different story. Klaus hadn't wandered into the forest in a state of confusion. He'd planned his disappearance. He'd gathered supplies. He'd found shelter. And he'd lived there, alone and hidden, for 9 years, documenting everything in his diaries. The translation of Klaus Bergmann's diaries, undertaken by German-speaking historians and psychologists in late 2024, revealed a man in profound moral crisis, a crisis so severe that he'd chosen complete isolation from society rather than continue living in a world he could no longer reconcile with his conscience. The first diary entry was dated September 24, 1967, one day after Klaus's disappearance from Fort Lewis. "I cannot go back," Klaus had written in German. "What I have learned, what I have seen, what I now know, I cannot unknow these things. I cannot serve in an army, cannot return to a country where those who should have been judged are instead given positions of authority, where crimes are buried and those who committed them are rehabilitated because they are useful." The entry continued for several pages, with Klaus writing about his discovery of something during his time at Fort Lewis that had shattered his worldview. He'd been vague about specific details, perhaps out of habit from military training about operational security, or perhaps because the details were less important to him than the moral implications. What emerged from subsequent entries over the following weeks and months was a picture of what Klaus had learned. During his time at Fort Lewis, through conversations with other NATO officers, and through documents he'd had access to, Klaus had come to understand the extent to which former Wehrmacht and even former SS officers had been integrated into the Bundeswehr. This wasn't secret information. Historians and journalists had written about it. In the desperate years after World War II, as the Cold War intensified and West Germany was rearmed to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, the new Bundeswehr had faced a problem. Germany needed an experienced military officer corps, but most officers with experience had served under the Nazi regime. The solution, pragmatic but morally troubling, had been to allow many former officers to join the Bundeswehr after they'd gone through denazification proceedings. Some of these men had been genuine opponents of Nazism who'd served in the military out of duty, but others had been complicit in war crimes, had served the regime willingly, and had committed or overseen atrocities. For Klaus, who'd been a teenager during the war and who'd joined the Bundeswehr believing he was serving a new democratic Germany that had learned from its terrible past, discovering that he'd been serving alongside men with blood on their hands, men who'd been given new uniforms and new positions as if their pasts could be simply washed away, had been psychologically unbearable. "I have shaken hands with murderers," he wrote in an entry from October 1967. "I have saluted men who gave orders that killed innocents, and I did not know. Or, perhaps, I chose not to know, which makes me complicit." The diaries documented Klaus's struggle with what he saw as his own moral failure. He'd been part of an institution that had made pragmatic choices about justice and accountability. He'd been, in his view, complicit through his ignorance and his service. But rather than confront this reality, which might have meant public denunciation of his own military, potential court-martial for desertion, destruction of his career, and shame for his family, or simply accept it and continue as others did, Klaus had chosen a third path: complete withdrawal from the system he could no longer be part of. He'd fled Fort Lewis on September 23rd. He'd driven to Portland, abandoned the car, and made his way on foot into the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. He'd had with him money he'd saved, camping equipment, and supplies he'd purchased in the days before his disappearance. The bunker he'd found had been a stroke of luck. It was an old structure, probably built in the late 1940s or early 1950s, during the early Cold War period. It had been forgotten, not maintained, but the concrete construction meant it was still structurally sound. It was remote enough that no one was likely to stumble upon it. It became Klaus's refuge. Over the 9 years documented in the diaries, Klaus had established a routine. He'd hunted and fished for food, supplementing his diet with supplies he'd occasionally purchased during rare trips to small towns where he could buy goods with cash and not attract attention. He'd let his hair and beard grow. He'd dressed in civilian outdoor clothing that made him look like any other outdoorsman or laborer. He'd read extensively, books he'd brought with him or purchased during his supply runs, philosophy, history, theology. He'd wrestled with questions of moral responsibility, individual conscience, and the weight of history. "I am not a hero," he wrote in January 1970. "I did not stay to fight against injustice. I ran away. But I could not be complicit. I could not pretend that serving alongside men who escaped justice was acceptable simply because it was pragmatic. Perhaps my isolation is cowardice, but it is an honest cowardice." The entries became increasingly philosophical over the years. Klaus wrote about the burden of Germany's past, about how one generation's crimes affected subsequent generations, about whether redemption was possible for a nation or only for individuals, about the tension between collective responsibility and individual conscience. He wrote about his family with obvious pain. "Helga and the children believe I am dead, or that I abandoned them deliberately. Both thoughts must cause them suffering. I have chosen my conscience over my family. What kind of man does that make me? But to return would be to pretend that what I know can be forgotten. And I cannot forget." By the mid-1970s, the entries showed a man who'd lived in isolation for the better part of a decade. Klaus was in his early 50s, had been alone for years, and the physical and psychological toll was evident in his writing. The diary entry dated February 28, 1976, was the last. Klaus Werner Bergmann was 53 years old. He'd been living in the bunker for 8 years and 5 months. "The winter has been hard," Klaus wrote. "I am not young anymore, and the cold affects me more than it once did. The isolation that I chose, that I accepted as the price of maintaining my principles, has become a weight I carry every day." He wrote about feeling tired, not just physically tired, though the harsh conditions of living alone in the forest through winter had clearly taken their toll, but existentially tired. Tired of the isolation, tired of the endless internal debates, tired of living outside the world. "I think often about what I left behind," he continued. "My children would be adults now. My son would be 25, my daughter 23. They have lived their lives without their father. Helga has lived as a widow to a man who is not dead. The selfishness of my choice has become clearer over the years." But even in this final entry, Klaus maintained that he couldn't return. "I cannot go back and pretend that what I know, what I learned, can be set aside. I cannot serve again in an institution that made the choices it made. I cannot be part of that world. But I am so tired of this one." The entry ended with words that would haunt investigators. "I am thinking that perhaps it is time to find peace, to stop carrying this burden. The spring will come soon. Perhaps I will see it. Or perhaps I will finally rest." And then, nothing. No subsequent entries. No explanation of what Klaus meant by "find peace" or "finally rest." The diary simply ended. When the bunker was discovered in 2024, 48 years after that final entry, there were no human remains inside. Klaus wasn't there. Forensic teams searched the bunker thoroughly, then expanded their search to the surrounding forest area. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for any indication of human remains, but nothing was found. Several theories emerged about what might have happened to Klaus Werner Bergmann after February 28, 1976. He might have died somewhere in the forest, away from the bunker. If he'd walked out into the wilderness with the intention of ending his life, or if he'd simply been too exhausted and weakened to survive another winter and had collapsed somewhere, his remains might have been scattered by animals over the intervening decades or buried under decades of accumulated forest debris. The Pacific Northwest forest was dense and vast, and even in the 21st century with modern search technology, finding remains in such terrain could be impossible. He might have decided at 53 that he couldn't continue living in isolation. He might have left the bunker with the intention of rejoining society, perhaps under a false identity. In the 1970s, before computerized records and widespread ID verification, it would have been more possible to create a new identity or to live on the margins of society without documentation. If Klaus had done this, he could potentially have lived for years or even decades under a different name, dying as an unidentified person sometime in the intervening years. Or he might have done exactly what his final diary entry suggested: walked into the forest to die on his own terms, choosing when and how his life would end. The German government, when informed of the discovery, had worked with American authorities to try to locate Klaus's family. His wife Helga had died in 1998, never knowing what had happened to her husband. Their children, who would have been in their 70s in 2024 if they were still alive, were located through German records. Both were still living. The son, Hans, was 74 and living in Hamburg. The daughter, Greta, was 72 and living in Berlin. Both agreed to be interviewed by investigators. They'd grown up believing their father had either died in America or had abandoned them. The question of which it had been, death or abandonment, had haunted their entire lives. Now, learning that Klaus had been alive for years after his disappearance, but had chosen not to contact them, had chosen his moral principles over his family, brought a complicated mixture of emotions. "Part of me wishes we'd never known," Greta told investigators. "When we thought he might have died, there was grief, but also a kind of peace. Now we know he chose to leave us, chose to live alone rather than be with his family. Even if his reasons were about conscience and morality, we were still not enough to bring him home." Hans was more philosophical. "Our father lived through terrible times. He witnessed the destruction of Germany, the Holocaust, the division of our country. Perhaps what he discovered in America was a breaking point for him. Perhaps his conscience wouldn't allow him to continue. I don't know if that makes him brave or selfish. Probably both." The discovery of Klaus Werner Bergmann's bunker and diaries in 2024 opened a window into a specific moment in Cold War history and the complicated moral legacy of Germany's post-war reconstruction. What Klaus had struggled with, the integration of former Wehrmacht and Nazi officers into the Bundeswehr, was historical fact. In the urgent years of the early Cold War, when West Germany was being rearmed to serve as NATO's first line of defense against potential Soviet invasion, practical considerations had often trumped concerns about justice. Many former officers had been allowed to serve in the Bundeswehr after going through denazification proceedings that varied widely in rigor. Some tribunals were thorough and honest. Others were more concerned with certifying that needed personnel were clean than with genuine accountability. The result was that by the 1950s and 60s, the Bundeswehr included officers who'd served the Nazi regime in various capacities. Some had genuinely been apolitical military professionals who'd served out of duty to their country, regardless of who governed it. But others had been true believers in Nazi ideology, had participated in war crimes, or had been complicit in atrocities. For Klaus, discovering or fully understanding this reality while serving at Fort Lewis had created an impossible situation. He could report what he'd learned, but to whom? The arrangements had been made at the highest levels of German and NATO leadership. He could refuse to continue serving, but that would mean court-martial for desertion and disgrace for his family. Or he could accept it, continue serving, and live with the knowledge of what his institution had become. His choice had been to flee entirely, to remove himself from the system he couldn't accept, but also couldn't effectively fight against. The question that historians and psychologists analyzing Klaus's diaries debated was whether his choice had been moral courage or moral failure. Had he taken a stand for his principles by refusing to be complicit, even at enormous personal cost? Or had he failed in his responsibility to his family and his duty to challenge injustice from within the system? The answer, most agreed, was complex. Klaus had acted according to his conscience, but that conscience had led him to abandon his wife and children, to live in isolation when he might have used his knowledge to push for reform, and ultimately to disappear without giving his family closure about his fate. He was a man of his time struggling with his nation's past. One historian noted, he couldn't escape history, and he couldn't reconcile his ideals with the compromises that had been made. His solution was to remove himself from the equation entirely. Whether that was brave or cowardly probably depends on which values you prioritize: abstract principle or concrete responsibility to loved ones. The final mystery, what happened to Klaus after February 1976, would likely never be solved with certainty. If he had died in the forest, 50 years of weather, animal activity, and forest growth had likely erased any trace of his remains. If he had survived and rejoined society under a different identity, he would be over 100 years old in 2024, and given average life expectancy, was almost certainly deceased by now. The bunker itself was designated as a historical site by the U.S. Forest Service. The structure was stabilized to prevent collapse, and some of Klaus's belongings, including his diaries, were transferred to museums and archives. The story of the German colonel who'd disappeared during the Cold War and lived in isolation for nearly a decade became a subject of historical interest and debate. For Hans and Greta Bergmann, Klaus's children, the discovery brought a kind of closure, even as it left questions unanswered. They knew now what had happened to their father, even if they didn't know his final fate. They understood his reasoning, even if they couldn't entirely accept his choice. "Our father was not a bad man," Hans said in an interview after the discovery. "He was a man who tried to live according to his conscience in a complicated world. He made choices that hurt his family, but he made them for reasons he believed were right. I wish he had chosen differently. I wish he'd come home. But I understand why he couldn't." The story of Klaus Werner Bergmann became a reminder of the long shadows cast by World War II and the Nazi era, shadows that extended well into the Cold War and beyond. It was a story about the difficulty of moral choices in complex situations, about the weight of history on individuals, and about the price some people are willing to pay to maintain their principles. Klaus had written in one of his diaries, "Every generation must decide what it will accept and what it will resist. The easy choice is to accept, to justify, to move forward without looking too closely at uncomfortable truths. The hard choice is to resist, knowing that resistance may cost you everything you value." I chose resistance, but I chose it through withdrawal rather than confrontation. History will have to judge whether that was enough. The bunker in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest stood as a monument to that choice, a concrete structure hidden by decades of forest growth, containing the possessions and the writings of a man who'd tried to escape history but had been unable to escape himself. Klaus Werner Bergmann had lived and disappeared on his own terms, leaving behind only questions and the record of his struggle with conscience in a world that demanded compromise. The forest that had hidden his refuge for 48 years after his final diary entry kept whatever other secrets it might hold. Whether Klaus's remains lay somewhere in those trees, or whether he'd found some other ending to his story, would likely remain unknown. Some mysteries, the forest seemed to suggest, were meant to stay mysteries. But the bunker had finally revealed its secret, and in doing so, it had told a story about the Cold War, about Germany's complicated post-war history, and about one man's ultimately futile attempt to find moral clarity in a morally complex world.